I'm John Sarah Ruth. I'm the director of the MFA Interior Design program at Parsons. And this is the keynote of our annual symposium, Aftertaste, exploring the boundaries of interior design and interior experience. So this year the topic is Immaterial Environments. We have some very esteemed speakers, and this keynote, who I can't imagine a better person to introduce this topic. And there was just this Radical Shifts panel talking about the history of Parsons, and I found out yesterday that Robert Irwin has an honorary degree from Otis Parsons. Is that true? I think that's true.
Probably not in existence anymore, but...
So just quickly, thanks to the deans of our school, especially to Bill Morrish, our Dean of Constructed Environments, and to Miodrag Mitrosinovic, the Dean of School of Design Strategies, and to Joel Towers, who made this possible for us to bring Robert Irwin here to you today. Thanks again to my colleague Joanna, to Alfred, and to Joanna for establishing Aftertaste, and for Joanna for introducing us to Sanford Quinter, who's introduced us to Robert Irwin. I'm going to hand over the introduction to Sanford Quinter. I wanted to say just a few more remarks that it's very clear, I guess, that Robert Irwin has taught me and so many of us, tens of thousands of us, how to see. Obviously legendary and influential to artists and designers alike, he is indeed one of the most prominent seers of our time.
Wow.
He's taken the human experience to wide and experimental places and brought his findings back to us with precise and revealing articulation. He's guided the perception of so many and brought awareness to experience that otherwise might have remained unknown. He's one of the greatest examples of a person with the most courageous, I would say, commitment to authenticity in pursuit of artistic revelation and truth. So thank you, Robert Irwin, for coming to Parsons. And here simply to talk with us about some of your thoughts and your experiences. And now I would like to pass over the introduction to our friend, my new friend, Sanford Quinter, who's come down from Harvard, a notable thinker and architectural theorist. And thank you for coming.
Actually, I came down from way uptown just now. I was at a conference, they were a 3-day-long conference, which everybody gets 10 minutes to speak. There's one thing I learned today is that you don't extemporize when you've got a very short bit of time. And therefore, in the mad taxi cab ride I came down here, I scribbled down some notes. You barely need my introduction. I must say that was very beautiful what John Sarah just said, and frankly, very similar to what I have to say. I will say this, is I'm not going to run through the litany, the incredible details of Irwin's now very long, very sustained, and frankly very singular-minded career, which spans so many decades. I mean, he probably doesn't want me to tell you how many decades it has spanned, but it's really an astonishing thing. I'd say after meeting Bob, we're going to embarrass him tonight. Why not? After meeting him and spending some time with him, especially only a few months ago, up in Cambridge, and doing what Bob loves to do best, which is basically to go walkabout, to go on walks, to open himself and to observe. I have to say, I came back and I reported to many of my friends that I just met the person with the greatest power of concentration of anyone I had met in decades. I have to say that that was something that has left me thinking ever since then. And maybe a little bit jealous. But in any case, I have very little concentration, so if I ever get through this. But anyway, the point I want to also say to you is that for those of you who are interested in some of the details of Irwin's career, there are two documents. One is his absolutely luminous book called Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. Now that's approximate, the title. It probably got a couple of those preposition's wrong. And then the great documentary film called Questions. Many of you probably have already seen it over here, but it's really extremely beautiful. Among the world-shaking lessons of contemporary neuroscience is that we do not see with our eyes, we see with our brain. This is a lesson that Robert Irwin discovered on his own well over 50 years ago and has been teaching it to a less and less resistant public ever since. Although he began his career as a painter and is still considered one by many, his true field of inquiry is the mechanics of experience writ large, how the mind metabolizes the environment through and entirely by means of the sensations of the body. The work of Irwin consists of placing himself into an environment with the immensely disciplined posture, which he will be essentially showing us today, of an open attentiveness, an attentiveness that goes far beyond the routines of vision and which are tantamount to a kind of calibration, a tuning, a simultaneous tuning of both environment and mind. Irwin is a reader and producer of situations in which all of the sensory data form an integrated complex and where it becomes the role of the artist and the viewer alike to operate almost as a scientific instrument to connect sensations that are not habitually connected and to separate and hold apart those that are all too routinely connected. The great 20th century composer, I see this Coke. I feel it's one of the, no, I see this Coke sitting there. You're trying to get a Coke at. The thing about this Coke, not only does it talk while you're talking, but it's an extraordinary, its role, if I may say this, in Irwin's mental and physical life is immense. You'd have to see the film to see that, to understand that. The great 20th century composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen once commented that there were two distinct artistic views of the human universe after the Second World War. The world can be seen either as a kind of university or as a place where we can conduct experiments and learn, or else it was a place in which to seek and find pleasures of different kinds. Stockhausen clearly placed his own work and habit on the side of the first. I would say that it could be seen as part of the ingenuous genius of Robert Irwin to have occupied these two poles at once. So please join me in welcoming Robert Irwin.
The last time I had an introduction like that, I was unable to talk. I mean, I was stunned. It's a weird thing. I've been around a while, and suddenly people are being very nice to me, which is very unnerving. And saying all these things, that's sort of surprising. And kind of threw me off a little bit here. I'm not even sure how I was going to begin. The subject is actually, it appears to be sort of obvious, but it's actually rather complex. But it also has a really incredible history, having nothing to do with everything all the nice things that Quinter said about me. But the history of modern art is about 200 years old now, and essentially that's what it's all about. If you think about the incredible development, which we'll kind of touch on, a kind of phenomenological reduction that took place, which is still, like all these things are, up in the air. Let me just say one thing to start with. Everyone's probably had the opportunity at one time or another when a teacher put a little red square pinned it on the wall and had you all stare for 20 seconds and then took it away, and suddenly there was a brilliant green flash, a green square, perfectly there. That essentially is everything that the conversation's about here, really. Why not the red? Why don't you see the red with the same intensity that you saw the green? And the answer is very simple. The red is coded. The word red, the square, pinned on the wall as an example, and you come to it with your mind. The other you saw with your sentient being, as it were. And it's that simple. There's nothing mystical. There's nothing, there's no magic involved, other than the incredibleness of it, which is pretty magical. So using that, if I use the word phenomenology or phenomenal, that's what I mean, that green flash. That's the phenomenal in the world, which we all have, we all know, except to the degree to which we have to make the commitments to coding our lives. You know, I open my eyes in the morning, and the world appears totally formed, as if given. I don't ask myself, how did I do that? I sit up and swing my legs over the edge of the bed, and I take the entire world with me in all of its complexity, billions of bits of information that it takes to form that moment, and I don't consider or worry about that. I simply go take a shower. If I were forced for some reason to lay there, even for an instant, two really quite magical things would be revealed. The first one is that I perceive all the pieces and parts coming together in that instant while I'm laying there. And it is not given. It is we make the world. So for an artist, in a sense, that's quite an interesting topic. How and in what way do we form the world? I would argue that that's one of the really wonderful gifts of being an artist, just to examine the complexity and the richness of that action. Forget the having a career and all that shit. It's too good a question. I mean, it's too interesting. So if you think about that for a moment, the second is even more spectacular in a way, and that is I couldn't move. Because if at every moment I was forming the world, I would be unable to move, obviously. So the unbelievable relationship between my sentient being and my cognitive self that's the miracle. It's spectacular. I'm touched by it. Excuse me. Anyway, there is that incredible moment as such that one discovers that in that green flash. Also, you know, you can take this thing as a very simple approach, which, coming from California, where the New York Times says it takes 6 artists to screw in a light bulb. We sometimes have a very simple approach to the thing. And it happened with me just before I came, which is I was standing looking up at the sky, and there was this wonderful, magical, in a way, ephemeral phenomena. And while I'm standing there looking at this thing, a woman next to me said, you know, it's beginning to look just like a bunny rabbit. And the lady on the other side of me says, no, can't you see the horn? It's beginning to look like a rhinoceros. And a man in a suit walked by and he said, it's a cloud. And the man next to him said, it's a cumulus. And then the man on the other side said, I believe it's getting dark and it looks like it's going to rain. And sure as hell, it starts raining. And I find myself standing there thinking, boy, this really smells good. So the point of the story being, how can you trust somebody who can't come in out of the rain? If you put the two stories together, basically, it's everything that I would like to say about this evening. One of the things I thought would be worth doing is to look at a few of the examples of the idea of this phenomenological reduction. Edmund Husserl in the early part of the 19th century came to the conclusion that we can't get there from here, and that and since we're completely encased in this structural world that we've put together, which allows us not to get hit by a bus while we're standing there contemplating our navel, in that moment, in a way, the whole possibility of our being in the world needs to possibly be re-examined. And his simple idea was that the only way to do that is to do a phenomenological reduction. That is, we're like encased in what we know. And if, in a sense, you can't get there from here, the only thing you can do is to essentially examine your own beliefs and your own concepts and your own meanings and go back step by step to a sentient being in the world and ask yourself a simple question: how could it be otherwise? So in a sense, the whole history of modern art has put us in the position of maybe simply asking that question. It's not an answer, but in a sense, a rather beautiful conundrum as such. Why don't we put that thing down? Okay. On the left is The Coronation of Napoleon by David, and on the right is Malevich, a white square and a white ground. Now think about that for a second. At the late part of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, here's this incredible pictorial logic. I mean, spectacular. It really is. This is not a great painting, but it's a brilliant example of a whole construct about the nature of seeing, about the nature of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at that painting for a good period of time, I ask you the one simple question. Over that 100 years, we finally, in a sense, find ourselves having to deal with this. And the question was, why? Why in the world would you take something so beautifully put together, so spectacular? I mean, why would you do it if it's not of some consequence? Now, I didn't do that. Essentially, a whole history of people from different parts of the world, with different backgrounds, with different reasons, with different motives, et cetera, so on and so forth, in 100 years, did just that. So what is the issue? What is the question? And it can't be ignored. It can't be either accidental or incidental that took place. It's a very interesting history as such. I will not go through the whole litany of getting from one to the other, but this is essentially what Husserl meant by his phenomenological reduction. He reduced this entire thing all the way to here, and when Malevich, not only his friends, but or I should say, not only his enemies, but his friends wanted to know, what in the hell have you done, Malevich? You've like taken away everything we know, everything we understand. You've given us nothing but a desert. And he said, oh yes, but it's a desert of pure feeling. And at that point, he essentially put in place the basic philosophic ground of the whole history of that modern reduction. Let's go to the next one. Here's another, in a sense, example of a phenomenological. I'm going to do this fairly rapidly because of all the people out there in very uncomfortable places. But here's another example of a phenomenological reduction. This is a Mondrian, who starts as a brilliant draftsman, the example on the left, and then takes a very rare example. Normally, there's big gaps in people's history, but Mondrian essentially followed a very, very careful step-by-step. He painted the painting on the right. You want to flip them? And step-by-step, he took this subject, the tree, and began to, in a sense, see it with another eye. He began to see that it actually was not just a pictorial element, but actually had a physicality to it, that it occupied space, that it moved in a way, that it had its own energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing mystical, twistical about it. He just began to see another facet of it. Go on to the next. Began to essentially explore this realm of the physicality and his relationship to that physicality in a really nice and kind of interesting way. Go on to the next. All the way down, essentially, till it became just pure energy. This is the only gap here. The others were all sort of trees, other than the flower. But this is what was called the Pierce series. But you don't normally get to see somebody take what they're doing apart like that. Absolutely, laid it out as a pure illustration to where we've come from that pictorial element to a world of pure energy, in which this factor is essentially the basis of our seeing. Again, at the green flash. Pure energy that you're looking at there. Pure energy here. It's not, in a sense, something that he invented or anybody else invented in a way. It's an observation about the nature of seeing, that it is, in a sense, that kind of an action. at that moment in time, he made a rather interesting statement, which I don't have, I have in my pocket somewhere, which is not in my hand, but so I'll have to just paraphrase it as a word. But he said, we've come to the end of the idea of figurative art. We're almost at the end of the particular form. And we have arrived at the world of pure relations. The significance of that is really interesting. Piet Mondrian, the architect? Mies van der Rohe made a statement. It's very effective at this moment. That statement was, less is more. We've all heard that. But the second part of that is less is more only when less is the sum total of more. It took a meditation on his part, probably his whole life, to, in a sense, deal with what that meant, how that meant. That this world of relationships is really complex. My first introduction to it was, I had never seen an abstract expressionist painting and thought I was an abstract expressionist painter, painting big, wild gestural paintings. And finally, in Los Angeles, an abstract expressionist show came. And I was walking through the dinosaurs when I saw my first two abstract expressionist paintings. One was a big James Brooks on the wall, maybe 12 foot by 7 foot. Strong contrast between red and green, large shapes, black, white, everything measurable. That had to be a powerful painting. And for me, that was a really important moment because as I slowly reduced my own, which I'll go into a little bit here, as I reduced my own, I was moving towards constantly this idea that the painting had a power to it. I didn't know what that meant, but it seemed like an interesting idea at the time. Next to it was a little Philip Guston, a small little painting about so big, a little scrumbly red, white. Are you familiar with them? They're very, very intricate, really delicate kind of painting. And a spectacular thing happened in line with that Mondrian. That little Malevich, that little Philip Guston blew the James Brooks right off the wall. I mean, it really had power. And I thought, how the hell can that be? But everything measurable, everything, significant in terms of tangibleness, the James Brooks had to be the most powerful. But the problem was that in the James Brooks, 2 and 2 never made more than 4. And in the Philip Guston, 2 plus 2 never made less than 5. So you enter into the world of relations, and you understand what Mondrian is talking about, the world of relationships, and you understand what less is more starts to become, because essentially he was able to finally take the thing down to its essences, so only certain key shapes. The problem is that in the hands of everyday practitioners as a style, it died. It died because no one knew what it meant to put those in, how those interacted on each other. And so it became a kind of vacuous looking style and died of its own, in a sense, loss of significance in terms of people understanding the import of how that goes, which is the key to this whole term immaterial. I don't want to, these are not mystical terms, but it takes a meditation over a long period of time to understand how these things all take place. It takes, in a sense, a hands-on understanding. Want to go to the next? This is a couple of my early paintings, pretty humorous. Full of piss and vinegar, signifying nothing.
Hair on fire.
But I was hair on fire, man, just painting that shit out of it. The thing was, I thought I was sort of a Zen person at the time, and I used to eat the right foods the night before, get myself in the right mood. I'd come in and there would be this big white canvas. I move, it moved. I'm right, it's right, right. It was the best. At the end of it, you passed out from having, you'd come and just, it was beautiful. I loved being an abstract expressionist painter. But a couple of problems cropped their head up. One was that I kept seeing things in them. I Rorschached it, I psychoanalyzed it. There was that rhinoceros, and where the hell somebody in LA got an idea like that? I'm going to go back to these histories. Where did this dumb kid in LA get the idea that anything of content, meaning in there, in that old sense of the word, that any of that immediately destroyed the painting. I guess it was osmosis, it was in the air, was the significance. Because, by the way, I was not a good student in school at all. I had a problem. I had a magical wrist. I could draw, I could do anything I wanted to. Perspective, so on and so forth. I just had this wrist. It kind of went on by itself in a way. It took me a long time to overcome that handicap. But I finally began to score on that. But so I did these paintings, and I started trying to figure out how and in what way do I, in a sense, eliminate? Want to go to the next ones? Eliminate these problems. And one of the problems was painting a painting on a scale like that. I was out of control. You know, I just didn't really control every piece or part or element of it. So I had a question, okay, how do I do that? I met a guy who was a really interesting man, crazier than a hoot owl, who I shared a studio with. And he would come out every now and then and say, "You've touched my hammer." I'd say, "What?" And he would suddenly take the hammer and throw it all across the room. I'd have to duck and get out of the way. A couple of times it went right through the window, broke the glass and all that. And so, you know, it was a nice awakening. It kept me on my toes. I really had to actually stay loose, as it were. And then he left, and I got another artist named Craig Kaufman, who was a terrific artist, who looked at my work and said, "You're a very smart guy, the smartest guy who lived in our neighborhood." He pulled his nose and he said, "You gotta be kidding." I suddenly realized, you know, I knew he knew what I didn't know in a way. So I sort of, to some degree, became a student. So I watched him paint. And he would sit down he'd put a smock on. He would sit down on a stool, had a little thing out there, one of those little medical tables, all, what was it? Stainless? Not stainless, but, yeah, exactly. And he would put out 50 cents worth of red, 30 cents worth of green. He'd put it out, and then he'd stand there and pull his nose like he did all the time. And he'd look at it for a very long time. Then he'd slowly walk across the room and go like that. And go back and sit down again. And I'm there, you know, like this, looking over at this guy. And stunned, because he was a better painter than I was by far. It was obvious. So I had to ask myself some real hard questions about this idea of being a painter that way. So I started looking at all the kind of false starts that I had in these paintings, and the fact that I needed, in a sense, to take some control. So he asked me over to his house one day. He had a nice little collection of Zen pottery, raku bowls, quite famous, that he had acquired during the war when they were sort of not held as a national treasure at that point, per se. And he would ask me over to dinner, and I would go to dinner, and he'd say, "How are things?" And we'd talk a little bit. He'd set up a can of Campbell's soup, Campbell pork and beans on the table with the lid open. And I'd give me a fork, and I would we'd both eat the beans. And at the end of that, if my karma was just right, he would put a box on the table. Beautiful little box, perfectly tied, small wood box. And then he'd allow you to untie it, and then open it up, and inside was a small cloth sack. You'd reach in and take it out, open it up, and there was a small piece of pottery. And at that point, the whole issue of scale suddenly became revealed to me, because the Japanese understood how to bring you down to that scale so that a thumb mark was significant, was powerful. So I stopped painting big paintings and tried painting these small ones. I also put them in frames so that you could actually handle them, that you had a physical touch to them as such. And I began to, as it were, have a much more controlled understanding of the painting, all right? Only one problem is that they were not very interesting. That is essentially very mannered. And I realized that the problem, of course, which had been all along, was me. I was the problem. I had not spent, in a sense, the necessary time to know how to paint that kind of a painting. So I went off and and spent 8 months on an island called Ibiza at the time. It was before it became a drug island. You had to go there once by a boat, but went once a week. And I didn't intend it, but just by accident, I didn't carry on a word of conversation with anybody for a year. Well, 8 months, actually. And in that 8 months, I had an opportunity to really think about these kind of things, all these issues about, because before I just thought being a painter was being a painter in a way, and that I'd gone to school and I could do that sort of thing. But now I had a chance to actually look at my own thoughts, my own ideas, and spend time with them. And really, in a sense, it was at first very scary. It's like pulling all the plugs out of a wall, out of a, what do you call it, those telephone things, you know, where you do. And what you normally do at a moment like that is that you call somebody, or you pick up a newspaper, or you pick up a book. And I didn't, which was for a moment very scary, to pull all the things of the connections in the world. But it then became incredibly peaceful. It became really a sort of wonderful sort of period of time. I came back with one idea. Wow. And the idea was basically a straight line. The straight line was how do you Rorschach a straight line? You know, how do you, in a sense, turn it into a rhinoceros? And so I started, want to go to the next one? I started with the straight lines. The ones on the left, which I didn't title them, but I would call them pickup stick paintings before anybody else did. And they became, I think, a little more interesting, a little richer in a way, a little more complex, a little more action, a little more interaction, et cetera, et cetera. But as time went on in painting these things, they became less and less active, less and less things in them. And the reason being very simple is that I found out I could make as much power, as much, you know, the things had as much going on in them with the less means. And by the way, as the less means started happening, they became more and more powerful as elements. Okay, want to go on to the next ones? And finally, it was a funny kind of period of time. I spent, I would sit there. By the time I got to these, we're now down to just on 4 straight lines. These are still paintings. They're still compositional. One still reads in that way. You still, in a way, have something comes forward, something goes back. So they still had some other kind of pictorial properties to them. I put this line on very carefully, and then I would sit there and look at it and go to sleep. Mesmerize myself, and I realized I had a very poor, you know, focus. So I spent time, and then I thought to myself, who the hell's ever going to spend this long to look at one of these things? You know, I mean, are you crazy? I mean, is this a nutty thing to do? And so I kept spending time looking at them, and I began to say, okay, who's putting the lines on? Do I put them on smart, intellectually? Do I put them on in an interesting way? I spent a couple of years putting on 10, 20 lines and going through this little napping off and thing. And getting better, so longer and longer. And then I got to the point where I could put the thickness of the line came just towards you, not even going this way, and that my eye could see it. And I'm thinking, am I shitting myself here? I mean, come on, are you kidding? Is this some kind of mystical game you're playing here? I think I see it. And first time to begin to discover the power of being a human being, of seeing. So I pursued it for a while, putting these lines on, and as such, my friends slowly were dropping away. I was getting a lot of work time. And then I had a kind of another epiphany that line was powerful enough. So let's go to the next. I painted these paintings. They actually have 2 lines on them. You can't see them in the slides. They're such that your eye becomes essentially, I would say in the simplest sense, suspended. You could not read them. I like this very much because the means is exactly the same. In one case, 4 lines, pictorial, read and understood that way. Here I have just 2 lines, but the eye cannot deal with them pictorially. nor can it, in a sense, solve it. You're essentially caught in a continuous process. I then wondered, what would happen, or could I paint a painting that didn't have a line in it? Not a mark in that sense of the word. So I spent some time thinking about that, and I came to the idea that the surface, which, by the way, I would put on, I would have to get in very good condition. That was back to my Zen training. I would make a big pile of the paint, and I would start in the morning. I would have to get myself absolutely, because it took about 9 hours to put the surface on this thing, and you had to do it non-stop with a continual motion to it, because if you stopped at any one point, you would see it as a spot. It's very interesting. The surface, in a sense, was just to have one little thing in the surface was as strong as putting a mark on it. So I wanted to have no mark. I had to do it in one 9-hour day. I thought that was ridiculous, but I was stuck with it, and I did it. And then I considered the possibility: why the line? What? I mean, and so I made a canvas. It was very slightly curved in all directions, but it was not a shaped canvas. Want to flip to the next? Very convex, very, very subtly convex in a way. It was already really quite strong. You put that next to a flat canvas, it was much stronger than the traditional flat canvas in a way. Now maybe I just wasn't smart enough, but I still couldn't resist the necessity to put a mark on them. So I made these absolutely bright dots. I bought the best paint in the world with the most pigment, so on and so forth, so they would last in a way. I put the red dots on very, very carefully with one green dot between every red dot. Pretty painful thing to do, just about wipe my eyes out. I used to have to lay on the ground for hours afterward to restore myself. It was a tedious thing to do, and I thought, this is not like being an action painter at all. This is absurd. But I was, I was possessed, as it were. So I made these paintings essentially. I showed them only once, really. I showed them at the LA County Museum, and all my cousins came to my mother and said, "Goldie," they said, "we're going up to the museum to see Bob's paintings." And she said, "Oh, I don't know whether you should do that or not." And they all said, no, he's our cousin. We love him, and we're so proud of him. We're going to go up there and see his work. So they did. And they came back to Goldie, and they said, "Goldie, there was nothing there." And my mother said, "I told you it wouldn't be easy." She was a comedian. Anyway, so now I've got these paintings, which are the best things I've ever done in my life. I don't completely know that I understand them, but there they are. They have all the power that I saw in that Philip Guston, with even less means, okay? So, but in standing there for a moment, because it took about, even for myself, for anybody, you had to stand there for at least a few seconds before it manifested itself. It's just a field of energy, going back to Mondrian. It just would manifest itself. It's like a ball of energy there with nothing to really identify or stop it as such. In that moment, though, a couple of things were revealed, which I had never thought about in my life. And that is, it's in a frame. Wow, it's in a frame. The whole goddamn thing is in a frame. When I look around at the world, that's not how you see the world. It's not in frames. You make elections, selections, what have you. The intellect does this. It does a kind of framing. But that's not how you see the world. You see it with all your senses. Tough question. How in the world can an artist essentially continually do something? A highly stylized learned logic is what a painting is. But how can you fit the whole world of the possibilities of a human being as a perceiving person? How can you put that all in a frame? It's a complete absurdity from another point of view. The second thing I saw, which was really interesting, is I saw the shadow around it, which I'd never thought about before. What the shadow? of no significance, right? And yet there it was. In fact, in the beginning, all there was a shadow around this frame. Now you have something here, it's really interesting. You have something here that can't be can't be measured, can't be weighed. If I move the light, it would change altogether. So from any quantitative point of view, any intellectual point of view, it has no significance. There's no importance. But as a perceiving person, we couldn't move through the world. We couldn't do any of the things we do without shadows. They're absolutely crucial to the whole process of seeing. So once you decide the idea that maybe being an artist has something to do with how we construct the world, how we see it, what we make it significant, how we put values in the place by what it is we elect to, as it were, let into our perceptual field. When people talk about ecology and that, that is an ecological issue. Because if I place a value on something, I wouldn't destroy it. I wouldn't do the things to the world that we do. Because it was of real importance to me if it became a piece and a part of the actual world as I knew and understand it, I would essentially treat it with that kind of respect. I've been asked to go to ecological things all the time, and I say, what the hell do you think I'm doing? That's what I'm doing all my life. So then the question became, obviously, how do I paint a painting that doesn't begin and end at the edge? How do I break the frame? Want to go on the next one? Good question. You know, like a kind of slow, step-by-step set of questions, not answers, because I don't have answers to these things. And I painted the painting on the left. What it was is it's a concaved, it's convex, piece of plastic, which is, as you can see, painted with a kind of stripe across it. A very careful phasing away to the edge of that. And for what it's worth, there's a painting that doesn't begin and end at the edge, which I thought was one hell of a moment in my life. And of course, only one problem. I'd now spent, 15 years going through this process here, and I'm no longer a painter, which is the only thing I knew how to do. Which becomes a whole new set of questions. What do I do? How do I act as an artist? Where's the canvas? Where's the world, essentially, how I deal with it? I didn't have any idea about the answer to that. So essentially, but I did know one thing. I knew if I went to the studio every day, I would somehow, in some way, do the same things. So I at least knew that I had to get rid of the studio, which, by the way, was a loss. I loved being a studio. I loved being a painter. But the questions were too good. Too good. So I got rid of the studio. The thing on the right is, you notice I also had a beard now. I became a mystic. Which is, of course, a joke, because I'm not by any stretch of the imagination. But I started trying to figure out ways to deal with the world in a direct way. The only way I could think about doing that was, first of all, that I couldn't make something ahead of time, that is, conceive an art and put it in the world. I essentially had to deal with the world essentially as it was presented to me, what I call like a kind of conditional response, a conditional way of going about it. What I'm trying to do here is not talk about whether I did or didn't do it, but the idea of that questions are really, in a sense, the beauty of this. That's why the thing is called the beauty of questions. It's not about answers. It's about an open inquiry, a continuous inquiry into the possibilities, which is, as a way of going through the world, unnerving at times, but really quite spectacular. I've been doing that now for a while. In the beginning, I hung out in the desert. Desert was a pretty good place because it had very little thingness to it, or the least amount of thingness to it. Magical place. You're driving along, and all of a sudden, boom, it just stands up and hums. You've all had that. It's a little bit like the green flash. Boom, there it is. And you're like, whoa, it's gone. Loved it out there. Four Corners, the sort of area I spent a lot of time out there. I also sort of let it be known that I'd go anywhere for anybody, for anything, anytime. Only nobody asked. But it was very important that that relationship was that I didn't go out with an ambition to change the world per se. I didn't know an answer. I essentially wanted an opportunity to act out in this thing. It's funny, somebody would say to me, hey, you know, we're kind of interested in what you do. Could you come? I'd say, are you kidding? I'm unemployed, you know, yeah, I'll come in an instant. And they'd say, well, how much will it cost us to have you come? I said, nothing. And they'd say, well, really? And I'd say, yeah. And they'd say, well, could you give us some idea what you're going to do? I'd say, well, no, I haven't the slightest idea what I'm going to do. They'd say, oh, yeah, of course. And then they'd say, well, yeah, but how much is it going to cost? You understand the dilemma I had in a way. So for a very long time, I was unemployed. Didn't get a chance to really work that much. In fact, I've been very limited in terms of the opportunities I've gotten. But over the years, I've gotten some really marvelous opportunities. I'm not going to go into all that, but the Getty Garden, working on Dia Beacon, which is a wonderful place to look at art. By the way, when I got that possibility as such, all the artists that were going to be in not all, but Richard Serra especially, was really pissed off. I don't want to be in a goddamn other work what somebody else did. You know, I loved it in a way. It was great. He's never looked better. I don't know if you've been there to see it, but he's never looked better. It's a great place to look at art. The key also being that, especially at this point in time, for me as an artist, it was a very interesting observation that the museums that are being built are really rotten places to look at art on the whole. They're full of ego, they're full of piss and vinegar, there's none of that simplicity that less is more really meant. What it was really about, that less was more. It was not about looking at the architecture, which, by the way, sometimes is really great, beautiful, quite interesting, but also on the edge of being unethical. I mean, there is a rhyme and a reason for a building, which is part of being an architect, part of the complexity of being an architect, the richness of being an architect, is putting all those parts together. The beauty, the flexibility, the marvelous qualities of its significance as a place and so on and so forth, but also to be a really, brilliant building, but also to function. That's one of the charms of being an artist and why all architects would like to think they're artists or want to be artists, because in a way, that's one of the things that an artist in the studio doesn't have to do. He, in a sense, has free reign. But now you understand the other side of the whole significance of it now, because this long history, we've come to a point where it's become necessary to find out. We've laid out the philosophic ground, feelings. Mondrian has laid out the conceptual ground, i.e. taking it down to pure energy. By the way, just a little side thing on this pure energy. Think about the educational system in a way. Well, I have a drawing class, and I have 40 students, whatever. They all come in with a drawing board under their hand. If I haven't already told them to buy a piece of charcoal or a pencil or whatever, they're going to buy it, that sort of thing. They come in, there's a series of little stools laid out in a semicircle with a model or with some kind of setup for them there. They all sit there at this distance in a way. Look at all the decisions that have been made, critical decisions that have been made without one moment of thought. They've already bought into a whole system. They've bought into a whole idea, a whole concept, a whole thing. In a sense, there's no open inquiry here already at all, right from the very beginning. So you set them up in that thing. You set a model up for them, etc., and they draw. And then you might even be so full of yourself to try and tell them how to draw, or to talk about a kind of drawing, or about that line doesn't have the kind of flow that the figure really has. And you tell them how to do it. It's almost insane in a way. So one of the things I did just for the fun of it, and not for the fun of it, just to make an illustration here, I went down to the print department and got a roller, real smooth, shiny, and I brought it and I set it up there. Then I took a piece of very smooth and shiny paper and pinned it at the back and set it there. Said, okay, now I want everybody in this room to draw exactly what you see. No other games at all. I want you to draw exactly what you see. And they drew basically two things which look almost identical. If they were to go to just the line would be, but they maybe do the chiaroscuro of curving over the whole thing and that, etc. All right? And then I would have everybody in the room walk over and pick it up, each one of them. Most of the ladies couldn't because it was like 200 pounds. And the piece of paper was a couple of ounces. And then I would say, I want you to go back now and I want you to draw what you know. And so you would maybe make a drawing which in one was black to indicate the physicality, the weight, another one just the thin line. The question then was, is this an abstraction? The whole history of modern art was never about abstract. It's a very funny idea. The word abstract in its root means to be derived from or related to. It always indicates a duality. The idea of this in relationship to this, which is pictorial art. When you look at a painting, you basically read it in terms of what it is a representation of, and the key to its strength is its veracity, that really does justice to this thing here. But it's in this kind of a relationship. When you change that relationship, you've actually changed the whole relationship of the observer to the process of actually looking. Let's go to the, how would that guy used to say here in New York? Let's go to the videotape. I remember him, I don't even know who he was, but I always liked that line. What's his name? Warner Wolf. Warner Wolf. Let's go to the videotape. Let's run that, you can shut that off. And let's roll that thing up a little bit and let's get a little light on this blackboard. Let me just sort of deal very briefly with the structural problems here, issues. Where's the chalk? Oh, there it is. Okay, here we go. I make a mark. That mark has the significance or the content or the meaning that I made the mark. It's intended. It's not just a scratch or an accident. It's not just something, that was left over from the last whatever. I intend that mark. On the basis of that, a rather miraculous thing begins to happen. It becomes a positive and it becomes a negative. But if I, in a sense, then compound that I make this mark into a sign, it takes on even more weight and more significance. It becomes more and more of a positive, and the space around it becomes, as it were, the negative that we're familiar with. I'm going to do this rather quickly, because I don't want to take all night here. They promised me a good dinner. Let's just raise the power way up. It now is, in a sense, a symbol or a sign of something of great significance, of great, in a sense, import, all right? So it becomes, in a sense, totally, this idea of positive, negative, becomes completely and deeply established. It also will be established by one repeated as the power one. So in a sense, we now become a piece and a part of a system. And these systems are of incredible value. So there's no argument here whatsoever. But we, in a sense, now have in a kind of interesting reality, or when we talk about actual and factual. This becomes factual in a way, all right? Now, if I take this thing and think about it in a pictorial sense, because this thing is also, in a sense, a hierarchy of meaning. In this particular case, we'll change it, make it easier for us. Let's call it art, okay? And we'll call it high art, all right? And all right, you just saw what I've gone through. I am somewhere very close to the deity now, at my age, all right? And so therefore, when you people should come in as students, I can correct your miserable offerings in relationship to my understanding of art. So all these little stuff comes in, and I can tell you how to be an artist and what to do, as it were. And I can guide you in that way. It works. I mean, you know, it's essentially one of the key ways of our whole system of education. All right? Let's just take this thing for a second and think of it in those terms. Two things. It becomes, in a sense, a hierarchy in which this is at the top of it, all right? And I know what up is, and I know what down is, and I know what good and bad. I can essentially, as a way, weigh my life and the significance of whatever this idea might be. It also was the key to deep space, in which you have all the spirit carriers and what have you in here, and nature in the background in a way, and something of great significance. So these things are are in a sense identical. The history of modern art, essentially, when you look at that phenomenological reduction that Husserl was talking about, is slowly taking out. Why do you give me those cups? This is just another way of doing it. The key, in a sense, in the hierarchical sense and in the meaning sense, is that I put meaning into this cup, or into this object, into this vessel. And a couple of really great things happen, spectacular things happen. I can now take this thing from my studio or my situation, and I can move it out to my gallery, let's say. And nothing of significance has changed, because it, in a sense, is contained by its content, by its meaning, in a sense. So I'm able to transcend points in time, or points in the geography of my world. Let me just put that further. I can, which I attempted one time early on with those paintings that I did, I could take it from California all the way to New York. And if it was such significance, in a sense, and really was art, they would understand it. They hated the paintings and they wanted wrong. They really did, and for good reason. Those paintings, in a sense, started to engage the wall, engage the space around it. I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go, but I did that anyway. So I did a thing which was almost heretic. I cleaned up the wall. The black baseboard, I painted it white. Okay, and they thought, guys had really bad potty training. I mean, he's because people with much more, a much different kind of quality, or a whole different. So it didn't transcend, but to some degree, it theoretically could. If the meaning was enough, that essentially it was so universally human, I can take it from my country to India, and people would understand it. They would essentially, because as human beings, we all have some of the same human overlaps and what have you. So when you think about the history of modern art, like I said, through the 19th century, from that David was this, just continually pouring out the content until less and less and less and less and less, until finally what you had was so-called minimal art, i.e. the object as an object per se. Now people thought of that as a style or as a moment in time. It wasn't, it was just a place to pass through, okay? Because once it becomes involved in being in the world, a whole new set of rules apply. It's another ballgame. So this idea of a history of modern art and this question of material and immaterial is like essentially two realities, two kinds of knowing, two ways of going, if you use a Cordy phrase. Let's go back to the videotape for a second here. All right, so this space gets shallower and shallower and shallower, which in terms of structurally, it becomes less and less and less and less of a hierarchy, okay? It gets down to here. To all we come down to a moment when we talk about the marriage of figure and ground. Now, everybody loves Picasso. He's so brilliant and he's so this and that. If you love him, you got to wrestle with this idea. And what it really becomes is what would a non-hierarchical structure look like and how would it work? How would I make decisions? How would I decide what up is, what down is, what good is, what bad is, et cetera, so on and so forth. Very, very, this is not me. I wasn't even born yet when this thing happened. It's a pretty significant history. And we go back to that thing. It's radical. I mean, it has to be some kind of significance. So the first question becomes, what would a non-hierarchical structure look like? And if that can't be resolved, then you can't play the game I'm playing outside outside of the frame. Let's go a step further. Okay? I make a mark. Is it just an accident? Is it something? On what grounds does it exist? I mean, how would we come to this mark that doesn't have any meaning or any purpose or any function or any sign? It doesn't become a part of a sign system. It has nothing more than its visceral qualities. The fact that you can perceive it, the green flashing away. There's a line, and there's a line, and there's a line. If I try and do it again, no matter how hard I try, I can never do it. It's never the same line. So the difference here, which I find very interesting, in this world, one of the big hue and cries about modern art is it had lost its consciousness, that it had ceased to be a human and dealt with real human issues and human meaning in a way. In this world, the observer essentially mediates this figure, and that's how humanity, the relationship of the viewer to humanity, is watching this sign system move and go through all the antics of being human as such. In this world here, it doesn't exist if there isn't an observer. I think the significance of that is pretty interesting, that you're the determinant. There's where the humanity really is, in terms of your ability to perceive, know, act, and understand from your sentient being as well as your cognitive self. The other thing here is that in this world, I can put a frame around this. Gold leaf. Elaborate and ornate on a red velvet wall, and meaningful, meaningless, etc. on a hierarchy as such. So you have this whole totally structured perception as such. Here, if I put a line around it, I can't really do it, because this just becomes another line. So what you have here now, here you have a positive and a negative with a beginning and an end. Here you have a positive. Think about it. How did that ever become negative space? It was never negative space. There's no such thing as negative space. When you think about energy, it is continual. Everything is energy. I'm being told now. That's what they're telling me. All the physicists, it's all energy. So you can't put a frame around it. So if you break the frame, which is what you do, you have two different cosmologies. One with a positive, negative, beginning and end. Think about that when you think about the universe. The idea that it has to have an end somewhere. Here, a positive and a positive and a positive in constant relationship to infinity. Now, whether it's a good idea, we're at that point right now. As I said earlier, we have made the break from the past. Certainly we've challenged it with that history of modern art, which I didn't do, which is there. And it's there with an incredible history as such. You have essentially now, in a sense, a whole new way of processing. In other words, we've turned the world really in a way upside down from abstract. It's funny, the word abstractly now applies to the opposite, to what it was in a sense before. So what are we going to do with it? One of the nice things about being an artist is that that's a good question. Okay? Where do we go from here? What kind of world does it make? We've already gone through the breakdown of that history. We've essentially established a new philosophic ground, as I said, a new conceptual ground. The abstractist expressionists essentially gave us a whole new visual vocabulary. And essentially now, in a sense, I break the frame and we have to find out, does it work? So the whole idea of a so-called art in public places, which is bullshit, it's the idea of art in public places. I mean, we're talking about trivializing something. It's just another form of graffiti. But the question of, in a sense, working directly in the world is a question of, does it work? How, in effect, if I work as an architect, even though I'm not an architect, I mean, can I apply this kind of thinking, this kind of knowing? Can I really deal with the idea of what is less is more? Can I actually, in a sense, bring some of the significances to it? I don't know. But that's the game I'm playing right now. And I find it really interesting. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. This history is going to go on for at least another couple of hundred years before we find out whether or not it was a good idea. You know, what kind of world is it going to make? Is it going to improve it anyway? What will be the tangible changes? What significance will we actually, in a sense, honor the ecology of our world and take care of it, or will we just fuck it up as we've been doing? Thank you. I actually never usually get questions. What I normally do is spend 2 days where if I go someplace and just hang out the next day while people have a chance to form a question, because this is a lot to swallow in one gulp. Yes.
A lot of people define art as one of the ways of defining art is like those 2 lines on the left, that there's a question of whether you can repeat it. And if you have a beautiful accident, it's not really art. But if you can control that accident, then it has human intention. Do you agree with that?
As a young painter, I relied on the happy accident. I think all young painters do. And then you realize that the happy accident is just a place to begin.
Situation to ask a favor of you, actually, and that is the next time you go to be a beacon, see if you have the same perception that I did the last 2 times I was there. I mean, I'm referring specifically to the work of Fred Sandback, who I didn't know at all until I first saw his work. I don't know how, 12, 15 years ago at Chelsea, the Dia Museum when it was opened in Chelsea, and the show of his work there just blew me away.
Joey, the first time I've ever had an assistant in my life, which is my friend Joey here, we spent a lot of time together, and the one thing about Joey is that he thinks that Sandback installation is brilliant. Now you get... now you got me in the horns of a dilemma. But first of all, it's actually none of my business. I try to, in a sense, I keep wandering away from this thing. My issues was just go. Do you want to take a minute? I was asked to spend time with the DOP. By the way, the architect office, which was called Open Office, is sitting right here. He did this auditorium, and we worked together on it. I actually did a project at DIA called Excursus at one time, and I met Michael Govan. We spent some time together. Probably one of the brightest people I've ever met, and also one of the best people to work with, in the sense that normally, if you're talking with somebody in one of those kinds of situations, the person who's putting up the money, who's building the building, who has the rhyme and reason for it, you kind of couch your information. You're very careful about how you expose it at what moment, because you don't want people to get committed over ahead of time. Michael was the kind of guy you came to and you got real input. I mean, he really asked you good questions. He really essentially was the best kind of participant relationship one could have. We looked for a place. They had a really interesting problem. The problem was they had developed over a period of time, through a process I won't go into, a collection, the same way the modern had got a collection at one point, and they had a very difficult decision to make. The modern essentially decided at one time not to be the modern anymore, not to be, in a sense, a active museum and a dialogue, but really to become that collection, which no fault taken. Brilliant collection was there this afternoon, worth the trip. Okay, it in a sense was a great opportunity, but in this particular situation, Michael didn't want to do it. He really liked it the idea to be an active forum for an active dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, which I really appreciated. So the thing to do was basically we were looking for a place to put that, but that it was outside New York, but not too far out. Because as it works out, the key thing was not just putting this collection somewhere, but as it's, in a sense, in terms of the space it's found, it's a day in the country. The beauty of it, and this is how I started with the project, I started spending time going up the Hudson River by train, going through Grand Central Station, coming out. It was almost like a slow, in a sense, withdrawal. You sort of go up along the Hudson River, etc. And so that drive is like almost a kind of a cleansing sort of thing in terms of not good and bad, but just simply the difference of being in the city and not being in the city, being away outside. So you arrive at this place, you get off the train, you get 7 minutes basically to stretch your legs, to walk up the slope and find a moment of arrival. It's an old factory, sits down in a basin, and there's a moment of entry there. That's very crucial because Michael did not want you to walk in it through a bookstore or through a Chotsky selling commission or whatever. He wanted you to be able to walk just directly into the art. And that was, I think, a really, not an architectural decision, but a philosophic decision in a way. Very, very crucial to the whole thing. So, but in a sense, in any kind of process like that, the moment of entry is absolutely one of the crucial opportunities. There's, in a sense, certain key opportunities in terms of any kind of building. For example, you spend all the money on a great facade on a building, and then 90% of all the people enter through the garage, which is one of the most hostile, ugly places you can imagine getting, I mean, it makes no sense. It's absolutely absurd. The idea of the facade, yes, there's an important in terms of how it's understood in the city, but boy, what a terrible way to enter. So you arrive at the top, and there's a moment of entry. You look down on what was a parking lot, what has become basically kind of an orchard. You walk down the slope, and you essentially arrive at another point where you see a kind of, you walk through the orchard, another moment of kind of entry as such. You arrive at an area where there is a kind of like a forecourt, outdoors, trees on one side, part of the building on one side, the parking lot behind you now, and this becomes a moment of entry. If there is a small building which is essentially to sell a ticket, take a coat, what have you, to go in, that building is very crucial to that moment of entry, in that one of the really nice things about Beacon, when you get inside that old building, is that, boom, it's this beautiful light, great sense of space. So the building is essentially a small little building, because you're outdoors, what could be bigger and what could be more. So it brings you down in scale. There's no artificial light in there. It's only a little bit of essentially indirect light. You walk through that little thing, boom, you get that moment of entry. That moment of entry is also north to south. So there's two windows at the full back of that thing that essentially pull you visually all the way through, which establishes, in a sense, the quality, the character of the space. But all these are on, to some degree, subliminal. They're not, they're like givens in a way. So you walk into this space, and my way of seeing it was that it was divided down the center, which they ended up not doing for other reasons. But the idea that you actually had choice, you had to make a decision one way or another. There's two ways to go through it. One is that you are carried through it or taken from place to place, which is a marvelous way to go. So it had to be laid out so that that could be done, but also had to be laid out for the person who is the opposite, who wants to make decisions and choices, to select to go this way, go that way, to amble, as it were, to move through it. So it needs both of those kinds of things, as it were. To make a long story short, I have no role in putting up the sandbag. Nor am I ever going to, in a sense, try and take that one. That's somebody else's thing. By the way, one of the things that I think is there are certain artists in that collection I have never seen look so well from my point of view. I mean, there are a couple of people there that have never been that great. So I go away feel real good, Okay, yeah.
When's the best time to see your pieces up there?
My piece out there?
Yeah.
You mean the whole thing?
Well, when it's blooming or...
Oh God, yeah. Well, that You know, just on that point, I think, of course, the best time to, by the way, I lived up there for a year on the Hudson River. It's absolutely, you know, it's a gorgeous place. I mean, it's a storied place. Everywhere around there, the Washington's army, the encampment, Washington slept here, you know, et cetera, the whole thing. I wake up in the middle of the night, I hated it. I mean, I didn't know. I was working so hard that after by 9 months, I sat down with my wife one day, and we said, what in the hell's going on, you know? And both of us, it was so melancholy. You know, I come from LA, man. It's like, that's why we're all lollipops out there. I mean, it's you know, I was a lifeguard as a kid. I used to be a swing dancer. I used to dance 7 nights a week. I mean, I had a really, and I had this horrible thing for being, I had a happy childhood. And it's not out of angst. I don't work out of angst or out of, you know, anger or out of any of those kind of, I think the world's quite beautiful, and I love being an artist in a way. So, where was I? Oh yeah, melancholy. But one of the things, just the adventure of doing it, I wanted that orchard to be a really, you know, very, it had very important. It used to be just an ugly parking lot. So the idea of orchard was very good. I went to start looking for trees. On the East Coast, the place where you buy trees is in New Jersey, basically. In the West Coast, it's Oregon. There's some great nurseries around where Princeton is. I mean, spectacular nurseries. And I got there, and there were basically no trees. It's like, whoa, you know, panic time. And the reason was that the industry had taken a dip about 10 years before, and all the planters had backed off, as it were. And so they finally, you know, so at that moment, there was a pickup in building, and all the trees were gone, all right? This is to your question, away. And so I'm now desperately looking around, asking, and finally I asked this really good friend of mine who was in that business, is there any place to get trees? And he sent me, I forgot the name of the place, High something, and I said, how come he's got trees? And he goes, he's such a prick that nobody wants to deal with him, you know? And nobody wants to buy his trees. So I went out there and I just, butter wouldn't melt in my mouth, you know? And I looked, and he did it. And I looked and looked and looked. In the beginning, I was thinking of trees that would be like cherry trees in the spring and that sort of thing, and nothing. And so I went, one of the things you have to do with plant, you have to go 6, 7 times a year because you see different things. Every plant has its moment in time. So you can't go once, you have to go. So finally, after like about 6 months, and I'm getting really nervous, it's in the wintertime, I go, and there's just this unbelievable, they're called Winter King hawthorns, just filled with berries, bright red berries. And in the wintertime, when you go there, which is the worst time of the year, when those berries are gone, that red berry against that brick building, I'm a genius, man. Is there any other questions, or do I get to go to dinner?
Let's do that.
Okay. Yeah.